Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. A newborn baby takes its very first breath. A tiny chest rises, then falls, as air fills lungs that have never before known life. That single inhale is the beginning of everything, and yet it belongs to no one. That breath was borrowed. We come into this world not as owners, not as rulers, but as guests. Every heartbeat, every blink of an eye, every inhale and exhale is not something we create. It is given to us. We borrow it from a universe that asks for nothing but will one day take everything back. Think about it. You didn't design your body, you didn't build your lungs, you didn't summon oxygen into existence. And yet here you are alive, breathing, speaking, listening because of a breath you never owned. It is humbling, it is terrifying, but it is also profoundly liberating. Because the truth is this: nothing is truly ours. Not our possessions, not our relationships, not even this body we protect so fiercely. We spend our lives trying to own, to grasp, to claim. But what if life is not about ownership at all? What if life is about stewardship, about gratitude, about honoring the things we are allowed to hold for a time before returning them to where they came from? Our breath is the most intimate proof. It comes, it goes. No matter how hard you try, you cannot hold one forever. To cling to a breath is to suffocate. To release it is to live. And so, hidden within the very rhythm of breathing is a teaching, an ancient wisdom spoken in silence. Buddhism calls it impermanence, the reality that nothing lasts. Everything arises, everything passes. We don't get to keep, we only get to borrow. This is not a sad truth. It is a liberating one. Because if life is borrowed, then we are free from the illusion of ownership, free from the endless struggle of trying to make things permanent in a world where permanence does not exist. Think of the way we cling to wealth, to status, to control. We guard them like treasures locked in a vault. But when death comes, and it will, not a single coin, not a single title, not a single breath follows us. They were never ours to keep. They were loans from existence itself. And this changes everything. When you see life as borrowed, suddenly every moment becomes sacred. A sunset is no longer just colors in the sky. It is a gift, a loan of beauty that you are privileged to witness. A laugh shared with someone you love is no longer ordinary. It is borrowed time, borrowed joy, a fragile and fleeting miracle. Even our suffering, strangely enough, is borrowed. Pain, heartbreak, fear, they come, they stay for a while, and then they leave. They are not permanent residents. They too are passing guests. This is why the Buddha taught, attachment is suffering. Because we hold on to what was never ours, we fight to keep what must eventually return. And in that desperate grip, we lose the very peace we seek. But imagine living differently. Imagine walking through this world knowing everything you touch, everything you see, everything you feel is borrowed. How gently would you hold things then? How deeply would you appreciate them? How quickly would you forgive? Because you would know this moment, this person, this breath is here only now. And when it is gone, it is gone. This is the paradox of life. Borrowing makes everything fragile, but it also makes everything infinitely precious. Perhaps this is why we are so moved by the cry of a newborn or the final exhale of someone we love. They are bookends of the same truth. We enter with a borrowed breath and we leave by returning it. In between those two breaths is a story we call a lifetime. The question is, how will you live it? Will you spend your days clutching at things you cannot keep, or will you honor the borrowed time you've been given? Because here's the secret. When we stop clinging, when we start living with the awareness that everything is borrowed, something shifts. The fear of losing begins to fade. Gratitude blossoms. And strangely, joy deepens because every moment is recognized as a gift. So let us begin here with the breath, with the awareness that the very air you're breathing right now is not yours, it is on loan. It entered your body unannounced and it will leave when it chooses. And as you listen, notice your own breath. Inhale, exhale, each one borrowed, each one a reminder, each one an invitation to wake up. For in this simple rhythm lies the truth of all existence. We own nothing, we borrow everything, and in returning it, we are free. This is just the beginning. For if even our breath is borrowed, what does that mean for the things we hold closest? Our bodies, our time, our relationships, even our very sense of self. Take a moment and look around you. The phone or computer you're using, the clothes you're wearing, the room you're sitting in, your mind might whisper, "These are mine." We're raised to believe in ownership, to treat life like a collection. My house, my car, my career, my family, my body, my dreams. But here's the uncomfortable truth. None of it really belongs to us. Think about your favorite shirt. One day it was brand new, crisp, vibrant, something you chose, something you called your own. And yet over time, the fabric fades, the seams weaken, and eventually it will tear. No matter how much you loved it, the shirt will leave you, or you will leave it. Did you ever truly own it, or were you simply borrowing it for a while? This is the great illusion of ownership. We treat temporary arrangements as permanent possessions. We clutch at fleeting things and call them ours. Even the body you're living in right now is not yours. It's a rental. You inherited it from your parents' DNA, built from the food grown in the soil, the water from rivers, the air from the atmosphere. You didn't create it. You don't control it completely. And one day you'll have to return it, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. And yet we live as if this body is who we are. We decorate it, we fear its aging, we cling to its youth. We call it me. But can something that is constantly changing, constantly decaying, truly be me? Buddhism calls this the truth of anatta, the absence of a permanent self. What we think of as I is just a collection of borrowed parts moving together for a short while. When one part breaks, the whole system falls apart. That's not ownership, that's impermanence. Look at wealth. You might say, I earned this money, it's mine. But is it really? The numbers in your bank account are just digits on a screen, shifting constantly. Inflation rises, markets crash, governments change laws, and suddenly what you thought was secure vanishes overnight. Even if you guard it fiercely, when you die, you cannot take a single coin with you. Someone else will inherit it, spend it, or forget it. We never own wealth. We only manage it temporarily, like a caretaker holding the keys until someone else comes along. The same goes for relationships. How often do we say, "That's my husband, my wife, my child, my friend," but no person belongs to us? They are individuals, free beings with their own paths. They come into our lives through the mystery of karma, and they leave when the conditions shift. To treat a person as property is to misunderstand love. Love is not ownership. Love is presence, care, and respect in the fleeting time we are given together. And yet the illusion is so strong. We live our lives chasing, collecting, guarding, defending, believing that ownership equals security. But instead of peace, ownership breeds fear, the fear of losing what was never truly ours in the first place. This is why people with great wealth often feel more restless than those with little, because the more you claim as mine, the more you must fear losing, and deep down you know loss is inevitable. But here's the shift. When you see ownership as illusion, you begin to live differently. Imagine carrying a glass of water. If you believe it's yours forever, the thought of dropping it will terrify you. But if you know from the start that you're only borrowing it for a short while, you'll hold it gently, drink it gratefully, and when the glass is empty, you'll set it down without despair. That is freedom. This doesn't mean we should renounce everything and live in caves. It means we live with awareness. Use the things of this world, but don't cling to them. Care for your body, but don't mistake it for your eternal self. Love people deeply, but love them as travelers walking beside you, not as possessions you can chain to your side. The Buddha once said, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Why? Because the river is always moving, always changing, and so are you. Ownership is like trying to scoop up the river and call it yours. The water slips through your fingers no matter how tight you squeeze. And yet, here's the beauty. When we stop trying to own the river, we can finally enjoy it. We can feel the cool water on our skin, watch it sparkle in the sunlight, hear its endless song, and know that this moment with the river is enough. So what about your life? What are you clinging to right now? A job title, a relationship, a sense of control over your future? Can you feel how fragile it all is? And instead of resisting that fragility, what if you embraced it? Because life is not about ownership. It's about participation. You are not the owner of this world. You are a guest invited to experience it. And the invitation comes with a condition. When your time is done, you must return everything. Does that sound harsh? Or does it sound like freedom? Freedom from the endless chase, freedom from the fear of losing, freedom to live here and now without pretending you can keep what is meant to pass. Ownership is the illusion. Borrowed existence is the truth. And when you awaken to that truth, every moment becomes a gift, one you don't need to hoard, one you don't need to fear, one you can simply live. If ownership is an illusion, what then defines our reality? The answer is woven into the very fabric of existence: impermanence. Look closely and you'll see it everywhere. A flower bursts into bloom, dazzling the world with color, then wilts before the week has passed. A child's laughter echoes through the house, and in the blink of an eye, that child is grown, their voice deeper, their smile changed. The seasons turn, the leaves fall, the snow melts, the sun rises, the sun sets. Nothing stays the same. Impermanence is not an abstract philosophy. It's life's most consistent teacher. Every breath you take testifies to it. The inhale arrives, you hold it for just a moment, and then it must leave. Try to stop it, try to cling to it, and you suffocate. To live is to let go again and again, moment after moment. And yet, most of us live as if permanence were possible. We try to freeze time in photographs, cling to youth with creams and surgeries, immortalize our names on buildings or monuments. But the truth whispers beneath it all. This too shall pass. Think of a relationship. The first time you meet someone, there's excitement, electricity, the thrill of connection. Over time, the energy shifts. Sometimes it deepens into a quiet, steady love. Sometimes it fades into distance. Sometimes it breaks entirely. But in every case, it changes. Expecting it to remain exactly as it was on the first day is like expecting the sunrise to stay frozen on the horizon. It can't, and that's not failure. That's the way of life. Impermanence is not our enemy. It is our reminder. It tells us, don't waste time. Don't sleepwalk through life as if you'll have endless chances. You won't. Every conversation could be the last. Every sunrise might be the final one you see. Every hug might be the last time you feel those arms around you. That's not meant to scare you. It's meant to awaken you. Because here's the paradox. When you truly see impermanence, life becomes more precious, not less. A cherry blossom lasts only a few days, but that's why crowds gather to witness it. Its fleeting beauty makes it sacred. If it bloomed year-round, people would walk by without notice. Your life is the same. Its brevity is what gives it value. The Buddha once asked his disciples, "How many times do you breathe in a day?" They gave numbers, thousands, tens of thousands. He shook his head. "No, you breathe only one breath, the one you are breathing now. That is impermanence in its purest form. The past breath is gone. The future breath is not guaranteed. Only this one exists. And when you live with that awareness, distractions fade, complaints soften, gratitude expands. But here's where we struggle. Impermanence doesn't just apply to beauty and joy. It applies to pain too. When life hurts, when grief is heavy, when fear tightens its grip, we forget that these too are passing guests. No storm lasts forever. No night resists the dawn. What you feel right now, even if unbearable, is not eternal. It will change. That's the gift hidden in impermanence. It softens our grip on pleasure and gives us hope in suffering. Nothing is fixed. Everything flows. Imagine your life as a river. You step into it today and the water touches your skin. Step into it tomorrow and it's not the same river. The water has moved on. New currents, new ripples, new reflections, and you're not the same person either. Your cells have shifted, your mind has learned something new, your heart has carried another day's worth of experience. Impermanence flows through the river and through you. So the question is, do you fight it or do you flow with it? Most of us fight. We cling to youth, to routines, to identities as if we could stop the current with our bare hands. But the river doesn't stop. And in fighting it, we suffer. The wiser path is to float, to let the river carry us, knowing it may be calm one day, turbulent the next, but always moving, always alive. This doesn't mean we live passively without effort. It means we live with openness, with acceptance, with the courage to face change instead of resisting it. To walk into each moment as if it were both the first and the last, because in a sense, it is. Think of the sunrise again. Tomorrow's sun will rise, yes, but you will not be the same person watching it. The version of you that exists today will be gone, replaced by a new self shaped by another day of living. That's impermanence at work. Every dawn is both familiar and brand new. And when you begin to see life through this lens, something extraordinary happens. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. Washing the dishes, walking to work, sitting quietly with a friend, these are not dull routines. They are unique moments that will never come again. Once past, they cannot be repeated. That is their beauty. Impermanence sharpens our vision. It reminds us that the mundane is sacred, that the fleeting is valuable, that every moment is a one-time gift. So the next time you catch yourself clinging to possessions, to people, to the way things should be, pause. Remember the river, remember the blossom, remember the breath, and ask yourself, what would it feel like to let this moment be exactly what it is, knowing it will soon change? Because in that awareness, suffering softens, gratitude grows, and life, in all its impermanence, begins to feel like what it truly is, a miracle. Listen closely for a moment, not to me, but to yourself. Do you hear it? The faint whisper of your own breath, rising, falling, entering, leaving, the soft tide of life moving within you. It asks for no attention, demands no praise, yet without it nothing else is possible. Breath is life's quiet companion, unseen, often forgotten, yet always present. And hidden in this ordinary rhythm lies an extraordinary truth. Your breath is the greatest teacher you will ever meet. Why? Because it carries the essence of impermanence in the most intimate way. You inhale, the lungs fill, and in that moment you live, but you cannot keep it. The air must be released. To hold it tightly is to suffocate, to let it go is to survive. That single act, inhale, exhale, is the universe whispering, everything must pass. Think about it. The breath you just took is already gone. You cannot replay it. The next one has not yet arrived. There is only this breath here now. The past breath is a memory. The future breath is a hope. The present breath is the only reality. And that is the heart of mindfulness. When the Buddha taught meditation, he didn't begin with complex theories or mystical rituals. He began with breathing. Be mindful of the in-breath, be mindful of the out-breath. He instructed. Why? Because breath is the bridge between body and mind, between life and awareness. It anchors us in the present moment, the only place we can truly live. Yet how often do we forget it? We rush through our days, chasing deadlines, drowning in noise, suffocated not by the lack of oxygen but by the weight of our own restlessness. We take hundreds of thousands of breaths each day, but how many do we actually notice? The breath is always there, patiently waiting to guide us back. It doesn't ask us to change, to achieve, to conquer. It simply asks us to notice, to return home. And when we do, something shifts. Anxiety softens, the mind quiets, the heart steadies. Because in that moment of awareness, we touch the truth of life itself, borrowed, fleeting, precious. Breath also teaches us humility. Consider this, you cannot buy an extra inhale. No matter your wealth, your status, your power, when the final breath leaves, no bargaining will bring it back. The richest king and the poorest beggar share the same dependence. Breath is the great equalizer, and it teaches gratitude. Every inhale is a gift, every exhale a release. We live in a cycle of receiving and returning, of borrowing and letting go. Even the air we breathe is not ours. It was exhaled by trees, by oceans, by countless living beings. Each breath is a reminder that we are not separate from the world but deeply connected to it. Think of a forest. During the day, trees release oxygen, filling the air with life. At night, they take in carbon dioxide. Your inhale may carry molecules from a leaf half a world away, from a wave that crashed in the ocean, from the laughter of someone you've never met. Breath dissolves the illusion of isolation. It shows us, you are not just you. You are part of everything. And yet, breath also reminds us of fragility. How often do we take it for granted until we can't? Someone who has struggled for air knows its value better than anyone. A simple cold that blocks your lungs, or the final breaths of someone fading from this world. Those moments reveal how precious and fragile this unseen force truly is. Breath is both ordinary and sacred. It is mundane, we all do it every moment. Yet it is miraculous. Without it, there is no life, no thought, no experience. The beauty is this: you don't need to go anywhere to find it. You don't need wealth, titles, or achievements to touch its wisdom. It is with you now in this very instant. All you have to do is notice. Try it. Inhale slowly, deeply. Feel the cool air entering, expanding your chest. Hold it for just a second. Then exhale, releasing, softening, letting go. That's life in its purest form, the cycle of receiving and returning. And when you realize that even this breath is borrowed, you begin to see all of life differently. You stop chasing permanence where it cannot be found. You stop clinging to moments as if they could be frozen. You start to live with presence, with gratitude, with gentleness. The breath is the silent teacher, always speaking, though we rarely listen. It tells us, nothing is ours, not even this air. Everything is borrowed, and in that truth lies both humility and freedom. So the next time you feel lost, anxious, overwhelmed, remember this. You don't need to search for peace in some faraway place. You only need to return to the breath, to the silent teacher who has been with you from your first cry, and who will remain until your final sigh. If the breath itself is borrowed, then we must ask, who is the one borrowing it? We say, I breathe, I think, I feel. But who is this I we cling to so fiercely? The ego, the sense of me, mine, myself. It feels solid, permanent, undeniable. Yet when we look closely, it begins to crumble. Think of your body. You call it mine, but every cell is borrowed from the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe. Skin flakes off, hair falls, blood cells die and renew. The body you had as a child no longer exists. Even now, it is changing moment by moment. Can something that never stays the same truly be you? Now think of the mind. Thoughts rise, stay for a breath, and dissolve. Emotions surge like waves, anger, joy, fear, love, none of them last, yet each one claims, this is who I am. But if you've ever laughed after crying or forgiven after hating, you know how quickly the mind reshapes itself. Where then is the solid self? The Buddha called this anatta, the doctrine of non-self. Not that you don't exist, but that the you cling to is not what you think it is. It's a shifting dance of body, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness. Like 5 streams flowing together, giving the illusion of a single river. And yet, we clutch at this illusion of self as if it were eternal. We say, my body, my reputation, my story, my success. We build walls around this me, defending it from insult, feeding it with praise, decorating it with achievements. But the more tightly we hold, the more fragile we feel. Have you noticed? A single word of criticism can pierce us like a knife. Why? Because it threatens the story of who we believe we are. The ego trembles at the slightest shake. It is a house of cards, forever needing reinforcement. But what if you loosened your grip? What if you let go of the illusion that this shifting body, these fleeting thoughts, these temporary titles define you? Imagine a hand grasping tightly around sand. The harder it squeezes, the more grains slip away. But open the palm and the sand rests gently without struggle. Ego is the closed fist. Letting go is the open hand. This doesn't mean you erase your personality or abandon your responsibilities. It means you stop mistaking the mask for the face. You stop confusing the costume for the actor. Because when ego loosens, freedom enters. You no longer need to be right all the time. You no longer collapse when life bruises your pride. You no longer live only for applause. Instead, you become spacious, open, able to breathe without the weight of me. And something beautiful happens, compassion grows. When ego rules, everything becomes about comparison. My success versus yours. My pain versus yours. My needs before yours. But when ego softens, the boundaries blur. You see yourself in others and others in yourself. Their joy becomes your joy. Their suffering becomes your concern. This is why the wisest people are often the most humble. They are not trapped in the prison of I. They know they are part of something larger, a web of borrowed existence, where nothing truly belongs to anyone. Letting go of ego doesn't make you weak. It makes you vast. A drop of water fears being lost in the ocean, but once it merges, it becomes the ocean. In the same way, when the small self dissolves, the great self, limitless, connected, free, is revealed. But how do we practice this? Not by destroying the ego, but by seeing through it. When anger arises, instead of shouting, "I am angry," notice, anger is present. When sadness comes, instead of drowning in "I am sad," observe, sadness is here. You are not the storm, you are the sky holding it. And when someone praises or insults you, remember, these are only passing sounds, borrowed voices carried by the wind. They do not define you, they never could. Slowly, gently, the grip of ego loosens, and with it, suffering loosens too. Letting go of ego is not about losing yourself. It is about discovering a self so much larger, freer, and truer than the small mask you've been clinging to. A self that doesn't need constant defense because it is rooted in truth, not illusion. And when you taste even a glimpse of that freedom, life changes. The world feels lighter. Relationships feel softer. Breathing feels deeper. Because you are no longer trapped in the prison of ownership. Not of things, not of others, not even of yourself. This body you call mine has never truly belonged to you. It is a gift, a vessel, a temporary guest house assembled from elements borrowed from the earth. Think about it. Your bones are made from minerals once resting in stone and soil. Your blood carries iron that was forged in the heart of stars. Your breath flows with oxygen released by ancient forests and tiny plants in the ocean. Even your skin, hair, and eyes are stitched together from countless meals, rice from distant fields, fruit ripened under another sky, water carried through rivers that have flowed for thousands of years. What you call my body is a collage of the universe, pieced together for a short while. One day every borrowed part will return to where it came from. The body you protect, decorate, and sometimes despise, it is not yours. It is borrowed earth. And just as the body is borrowed, so is your time. Every morning when you wake up, you receive a gift no one can guarantee. Another day. But the hours are not yours to keep. You cannot store them in a bank. You cannot buy more when they run out. Each moment arrives like a coin in your hand, and whether you spend it wisely or waste it in distraction, it slips away just the same. This is why the Buddha reminded us, the trouble is you think you have time, but you don't. None of us do. What we have are borrowed breaths strung together like beads on a fragile thread. At any moment the thread can break. And yet instead of cherishing this loan of time, we live as if it were infinite. We postpone joy, saying, someday I'll rest, someday I'll love more, someday I'll live fully. But someday is not promised. Someday is an illusion. What you truly have is today, this hour, this breath. Imagine holding a beautiful flower freshly bloomed. You know it will not last. You cannot freeze its petals or command it to stay open forever. But that is precisely why its beauty pierces your heart so deeply, because it is fleeting, because it is fragile. Life too is like this flower, borrowed, precious, not to be owned but to be appreciated while it blooms in your hands. And yet so often we abuse both body and time. We push our bodies beyond exhaustion, chasing endless goals. We poison them with anger, stress, and indulgence. We treat time as if it were cheap, scrolling endlessly, worrying needlessly, drowning in trivial distractions. And only when illness strikes or death brushes close do we realize how costly this negligence is. But what if you began to see your body as a sacred loan and your time as a treasure on lease? You would treat your body with reverence, not vanity, nourishing it instead of punishing it, resting it instead of exploiting it, using its strength not just for selfish pursuits but to serve, to create, to love. And you would treat time with care, not as a burden to kill, but as a flame to keep alive. You would notice the miracle of each ordinary moment, the taste of tea, the sound of laughter, the warmth of sunlight on your skin. You would no longer waste days in regret or resentment because you would know these are borrowed days, never to return. Seeing body and time as borrowed doesn't make life grim. It makes it urgent, luminous, alive. Because when you know something will not last, you finally learn to cherish it. Think of those you love. Parents, children, friends. They too are borrowed presences in your life. Every hug, every word, every shared smile is a treasure that will one day vanish. To live with this awareness is not to drown in sorrow, but to awaken into gratitude. To stop taking for granted what is not guaranteed. And so, each day you breathe, each step you take, each moment you open your eyes, it is all borrowed. A silent reminder of both fragility and miracle. The body is not yours, time is not yours, but for now they are in your hands. The question is, how will you use this loan? Will you squander it in endless grasping? Or will you honor it by living fully, wisely, compassionately? Because when the loan is recalled, when the body returns to earth and the clock of life stops ticking, what will matter is not how long you borrowed, but how deeply you lived. If even our body and time are borrowed, what about the people who walk beside us? What about the ones we love most, family, friends, companions who light our days? We call them my husband, my wife, my child, my friend. We wrap them in the word mine, as though love could equal ownership. But just as your body is on loan from the earth, the people you cherish are on loan from the universe. Think back to the first time you held someone you love, maybe the fragile hand of a newborn child, maybe the warm grasp of a partner, maybe the embrace of a parent. Did you notice? None of those moments were guaranteed. You did not own that child's future. You could not command that partner's heart to never change. You could not freeze your parent in time. All you had was a moment, beautiful, fleeting, borrowed. And yet, because we forget this, we cling. We demand. We try to shape others into extensions of ourselves. We say, don't leave me, don't change, stay as you are forever. But love bound by chains of ownership always cracks under pressure, because no one, not even the dearest soul, can belong to us. The Buddha once said, separation from what we love is suffering. Why? Because we confuse love with possession. We think, as long as I have you, I am safe. But life whispers another truth. As long as you love, you are free. When we recognize that relationships are borrowed, they become more precious, not less. Because suddenly we stop taking them for granted. Every conversation with a parent becomes sacred because one day their voice will fall silent. Every shared laugh with a friend becomes golden because someday distance or death will separate your paths. Every touch, every word of kindness, every ordinary meal shared across the table, it glows with meaning when you remember. None of this is promised. Borrowed love is fragile, but it is also miraculous. Two lives, two stories, two streams of borrowed time meeting and intertwining for a while. What greater wonder could there be? And when you see relationships in this light, love changes shape. It becomes softer, freer. You no longer try to cage it. Instead, you honor it. You nourish it while it's here. You release it gracefully when it must leave. This doesn't mean you stop loving deeply. On the contrary, you love with more intensity, because you know the loan is short. You don't waste time in endless arguments over pride. You don't hold back, I love you, for the perfect moment. You don't let resentment steal days that could be filled with tenderness. Instead, you forgive more quickly. You listen more fully. You cherish more fiercely, because you know, borrowed love is not eternal in time, but it can be eternal in impact. Think of the people who shaped you, a teacher who believed in you, a friend who stood by you, a parent who sacrificed for you. Some of them may be gone, but the love they loaned you continues to live in your heart, shaping your choices, guiding your steps. This is the beauty of borrowed relationships. Even when the loan ends, the fragrance remains. So hold your loved ones gently. Celebrate them while they are near. Let every word of kindness flow freely, for the chance may not come again. And when separation comes, as it always will, bow to the truth. They were never yours to keep. They were gifts, borrowed for a season, cherished forever in memory. Because love, at its highest, is not ownership. Love is the courage to let someone be free, even while they walk beside you. Love is gratitude for the loan, without clinging when it must be returned. If everything is borrowed, then death is not a thief. Death is simply the moment when all loans are called back. We fear it, resist it, try to ignore it. We whisper around it as if silence could keep it away, but death is not an intruder. It is the most natural guest in life's house. From the very first breath, we are already walking toward it. Think of your body. For years it has borrowed minerals, water, air, and when death arrives, it gently says, "Return what you borrowed." The bones go back to the soil. The breath dissolves into the wind. The body that once carried your laughter, your pain, your love, it does not disappear, it transforms, flowing back into the great cycle of nature. Think of time. Every hour you lived was a coin borrowed from eternity. At death, the clock simply stops lending. And what you did with those borrowed hours, that is the only thing you can take with you. Not wealth, not titles, not possessions. Only the imprints of your choices, the echoes of your actions, the seeds of karma sown into the fabric of existence. And think of relationships. The faces you loved, the hands you held at death, you cannot hold on. No matter how fierce the love, every bond must release. It is not cruelty, it is the way of borrowed things. To have cherished someone deeply is not wasted. That love, too, becomes part of the world, shaping others long after you are gone. So why do we fear death so much? Because we mistake the borrowed for the permanent. We believe this body is me, this life is mine, these people are mine. And when they are recalled, we feel robbed. But when you live with the awareness that none of it was ever yours, death loses its sting. To see death clearly is not to be morbid. It is to awaken. For the truth of impermanence is what gives life its urgency and beauty. Just as a flower is precious because it will wilt, so too is life radiant because it will end. If we lived forever, would we ever learn to love so fiercely, forgive so quickly, or treasure so deeply? The Buddha encouraged us not to run from death but to contemplate it, not with dread but with clarity, because to remember death is to remember how to live. Each breath could be the last, so let it be filled with kindness. Each day could be the final one, so let it be lived with meaning. Imagine standing before death not as a terrified prisoner, but as a wise guest, bowing in gratitude. Thank you for the loan. Thank you for the time, the body, the love, the lessons. I return them now with open hands. Such a farewell is not defeat, it is freedom. It is the realization that you were never the owner, only the steward, that everything you borrowed was a blessing, not a possession. And so death is not the end, it is the great return. The river flows back to the ocean. The breath dissolves into the wind. The flame rejoins the fire. And what remains is not nothingness, but continuity, the seeds you planted, the love you shared, the wisdom you lived. To live well is to prepare for this return. To spend your borrowed time with grace so that when the final moment comes, you can let go without regret. Because you will know, you honored the loan and you gave back more beauty than you took. If death is the final return, then freedom lies not in clinging but in letting go. And this is the gift of non-attachment, the ability to walk through life with open hands, not clenched fists. Non-attachment does not mean indifference. It does not mean refusing to love, refusing to care, refusing to dream. No. Non-attachment means you love without trying to own, you care without trying to control, you dream without fearing loss. It is not detachment from life, it is freedom within life. Imagine holding a butterfly. If you clutch it tightly, you crush its fragile wings. But if you let it rest gently in your palm, it can stay, it can even return, but it is always free. This is how non-attachment works. It is love without cages, joy without chains, life without fear of loss. We often confuse attachment with love. We say, I can't live without you. I need you to be mine forever. But this is not love. It is possession dressed as love. True love says, I cherish you while you're here, and when you must go, I will let you go with gratitude. Attachment is heavy. It makes us anxious, jealous, fearful. Non-attachment is light. It allows us to breathe, to trust, to accept. When you live without grasping, life flows. When you cling, life suffocates. Think of the river. It does not cling to the water that passes. Each drop flows on, and yet the river never runs dry. In the same way, when you release each moment, each possession, each relationship with grace, you discover that life is endlessly full. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. Why? Because everything you cling to will change, will fade, will leave. If your happiness depends on holding tightly, then suffering is guaranteed. But if your happiness rests in openness, gratitude, and letting things be, then no change can steal your peace. Non-attachment is not passive. It is active wisdom. It means you engage fully with life. You love, you work, you play, you create, but you do so with awareness that none of it is yours to keep. And that awareness transforms how you live. You love more purely because you're not trying to own. You give more freely because you're not keeping score. You forgive more easily because you're not chained to pride. You enjoy more deeply because you're not obsessed with permanence. And the paradox is this: when you let go, you actually receive more, because you stop suffocating life with expectations. You allow people, moments, and experiences to reveal themselves as they are: fleeting, imperfect, beautiful. Non-attachment is the secret doorway to freedom. The freedom to live without fear of loss. The freedom to love without jealousy. The freedom to succeed without arrogance and to fail without despair. The freedom to face death not as an enemy but as the natural return of all things. To live with non-attachment is to live lightly. Not shallowly, but with depth and grace. You carry nothing tightly, yet you hold everything dearly. Like a traveler who knows the journey is short, you walk with gratitude for every borrowed gift along the way. And when the end comes, when the final breath is taken back, when the body dissolves, when the story closes, the one who has lived with non-attachment leaves without fear, without regret, without unfinished grasping, because they have already learned the art of letting go. This is freedom, not found in ownership, not found in permanence, but in the open hands of a heart that knows everything was borrowed and that was enough. And so here we arrive at the end of our journey, the final breath, the moment when all that was borrowed must be returned. The body you cared for, the time you spent, the relationships you cherished, the treasures you guarded, the stories you told yourself, all of them go back to where they came from. Nothing is truly lost because nothing was ever owned. It was all given on loan for a little while. At the last breath, the illusion of ownership finally dissolves. No title, no wealth, no reputation crosses the threshold. Only the imprint of your kindness, the seeds of your actions, the love you gave without condition. These are the only things that follow you. Everything else returns. But if you have lived with this awareness all along, then the last breath is not a terror. It is not a thief in the night. It is simply the closing of a book you have read with gratitude. You bow to the story, return it to the shelf, and step into the vast silence from which all stories arise. Think of a candle burning. It does not rage when the flame goes out. It has given its light. It has warmed the darkness. Its purpose is complete. In the same way, the last breath is not failure but fulfillment. The body returns to earth, the breath to air, the mind to silence, and what remains is the echo of how you lived. So the question is not, how long will I live? But how will I live while the loan is mine? Will you spend your borrowed days chasing shadows, clinging to what cannot last? Or will you honor the loan with love, with wisdom, with presence? Because when you live each moment as borrowed, every breath becomes precious. Every encounter becomes sacred. Every sunrise becomes a miracle. And when the last breath comes, you will not be grasping desperately at what must return. Instead, you will smile, knowing you have lived fully, loved deeply, and let go gracefully. This is the art of life, not ownership, not permanence, but gratitude for the borrowed gifts, body, time, love, even breath itself. And so, as you breathe now, remember, it is borrowed. But in this borrowing lies the greatest gift, the chance to awaken, to love, to live with open hands. When the last breath comes, may it be gentle, may it be free, may it be a return not with fear but with gratitude, because everything was borrowed and you lived well with what was given. If this reflection touched something within you, let it be more than just words. Carry it into your breath, your steps, your daily life. And if you wish to continue walking this path with us, learning, reflecting, awakening, I invite you to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe so each new teaching can find its way to you, like a bell gently calling you back to presence. Share this message so others too may remember the beauty of this borrowed life. And leave your thoughts below, your voice, your experience, your journey, so together we can weave a space of wisdom and compassion. Until our next meeting, breathe gently, live gratefully, and remember, everything is borrowed, even this moment. Cherish it.